The rain was freezing the night Jack found the taped-up crate. He didn't want a dog. He certainly didn't want the blood-stained note tucked into its collar. But some wars follow you home, and a dying town was about to learn this Navy SEAL wasn't done fighting. The heater in Jack's rusted Ford F-150 rattled like a dying man's cough, blowing lukewarm air that did nothing against the Pacific Northwest damp. Rain didn't fall so much as it attacked, blowing sideways in sheets that hammered the windshield and turned the dirt road up to Blackwood Ridge. No, strike that, up to Pine Ridge, into a slick ribbon of mud. Jack gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, fighting the truck's alignment as it tried to drag him toward the steep, forested drop-off. His right knee throbbed, a deep, grinding ache that always flared up when the barometric pressure tanked. It was a parting gift from a blast in Helmand Province, a permanent reminder of a life he had traded for this isolated, mold-smelling cabin 50 miles from the nearest interstate. He had come to Oak Haven for the silence. He had come here because the trees didn't ask questions and the local wildlife didn't flinch when he woke up screaming. The headlights cut a weak yellow cone through the dark. That was when he saw it. A flash of silver in the ditch. Jack hit the brakes. The truck skidded, fishtailing slightly before coming to a heavy, squelching stop. He sat idling for a moment, the wipers slapping rhythmically. Most people would have kept driving. People out here dump trash all the time. Old refrigerators, rusted car parts, things they didn't want the county to charge them for at the dump. But the silver flash wasn't sheet metal. It was duct tape. Jack killed the engine. The silence of the cab was instantly replaced by the roar of the storm outside. He grabbed his mag light from the passenger seat, his thumb naturally resting on the switch, and pushed his door open. The cold hit him like a physical blow. Mud sucked at his boots as he slid down the embankment, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the deluge. It was a heavy-duty plastic storage bin. The lid was secured with haphazard strips of silver duct tape, plastered on in a frantic hurry. But it wasn't just dumped. It was pushed deep into the hollow of a rotted oak stump, shielded from the worst of the wind. Someone had tried to hide it, and there were holes, jagged, uneven punctures driven through the thick plastic of the lid, likely by a screwdriver. Jack stopped. His training kicked in, a cold, familiar clarity washing over the pain in his leg. Box on the side of the road, hidden, modifications made. In another life, on another continent, this was an IED. But this was Oregon. He stepped closer, angling the beam. Over the pounding rain, he heard it. A scratch. Faint. Rhythmic. Jack drew his pocket knife, a heavy black-bladed folder. He jammed the point under the duct tape and sliced upward, ripping the adhesive free. He kicked the lid off, keeping his distance, light pinned on the interior. He exhaled, the breath pluming white in the freezing air. Sitting in the bottom of the bin, shivering so violently it looked like it was vibrating, was a puppy. It was a German shepherd, maybe 8 weeks old. It was all ears and oversized paws, its coat soaked through to the skin, plastered flat against ribs that were too sharp, too visible. Jack stared. The dog stared back. It didn't whine. It didn't cower. It just looked up at him, amber eyes wide, locked onto Jack's face with an intensity that was deeply unnatural for an animal that young. It was the look of something that had already learned that making noise got you killed. "Jesus," Jack muttered. He reached down. The pup didn't flinch. Jack got his hands under its belly, it weighed practically nothing, and lifted it against his chest. The dog smelled of damp earth, wet fur, and something sharper. metallic. Blood. Jack turned and scrambled back up the slick embankment. He threw the passenger door open, deposited the shivering bundle onto the torn upholstery, and blasted the heat as high as it would go. He climbed into the driver's seat, wiping rain from his face, and looked at the dog. It was sitting exactly where he had placed it, not exploring the cab, not crying, just watching him. It had a thick makeshift collar around its neck, woven out of military-grade 550 paracord. Jack reached over, running a callous thumb over the dog's wet head. The pup leaned into the touch, just a fraction of an inch, a desperate, silent bid for warmth. "All right," Jack said, his voice gravelly from disuse. "Let's get you home." The drive back to the cabin was a blur of grinding gears and blinding rain. Jack's mind raced. The duct tape, the holes, the blood smell. It wasn't an accidental litter someone dumped because they couldn't afford the feed. It was a deliberate hiding, a desperate act. When he finally parked under the sagging, corrugated tin roof of his carport, Jack grabbed the pup, stuffing it inside his heavy canvas jacket to shield it from the wind. He unlocked the cabin door, the hinges protesting, and stepped into the dark, dry interior. He flipped the light switch. The bare bulb in the center of the room flickered to life, casting harsh shadows over the sparse furniture, the wood stove, and the stack of chopped fur in the corner. Jack set the dog down on an old wool blanket. He grabbed a towel from the bathroom and knelt, rubbing the pup down. The dog stood rigidly, letting Jack work, those amber eyes still tracking his every movement. It was a beautiful animal beneath the mud and the starvation. The sloping back, the thick bone structure in the legs. This wasn't a backyard mutt. This was a working line, a K9. As Jack dried the dog's neck, his fingers brushed against something stiff tucked beneath the tight weave of the paracord collar. He stopped. He pulled the towel away and looked closer. Wedged tight against the dog's throat, wrapped in a layer of clear plastic wrap, was a folded piece of paper. Jack's jaw tightened. He slipped 2 fingers under the cord and pulled the plastic free. The puppy watched him, letting out a single, low huff of breath. Jack stood up, walking toward the harsh light of the kitchen peninsula. He peeled back the wet plastic. Inside was a piece of cheap, ruled notebook paper, the kind ripped from a high school binder. The edges were smeared with rust-colored fingerprints. Blood. Jack unfolded the paper. The handwriting was erratic, the letters jagged and deeply indented into the cheap paper. Someone had written this fast, pressing down hard enough to tear the fibers. They took the rest of the litter to the old Miller rendering plant. They're using them for the fighting pits. My dad couldn't pay the sheriff what he owed. They killed him. I hid this one. His name is Titan. He's from the county's K9 breeding stock. If you find him, take him far away. Don't go to the local cops. Mayor Higgins owns them. Please. There was no signature, just the bloody thumbprint at the bottom corner. Jack read the note 3 times. He placed it flat on the laminate counter, his hands resting on either side of it. The silence in the cabin was absolute, save for the crackle of the wood stove catching fire and the steady drum of rain on the tin roof. He looked over his shoulder. The puppy, Titan, was sitting on the edge of the wool blanket. He had stopped shivering. He was watching the door. Jack scrubbed a hand over his face, feeling the rough stubble on his jaw. He had spent 10 years in naval special warfare. He had seen the absolute worst of what humanity had to offer in mud brick compounds and desert valleys. He had come back with a broken body, a shattered squad, and a profound desire to never touch a weapon again in anger. He moved to Oak Haven because it was dying, a former logging town slowly suffocating under the weight of lost industry and opioid addiction. It was a place where people minded their own business because getting involved cost too much. He didn't want this. He didn't want to know about a dead father, a terrified kid, or a corrupt mayor. He just wanted to drink his coffee and watch the trees grow. But he looked at the blood on the paper. Then he looked at the dog. Titan wasn't acting like a puppy. He was acting like a soldier waiting for orders. "Damn it," Jack whispered to the empty room. He spent the rest of the night making the dog a bed near the stove and boiling up some plain white rice and chicken broth from his pantry. Titan ate methodically, not gorging, just taking what he needed. When Jack finally lay down on his own cot, the dog didn't whine or pace. He curled up facing the front door, guarding it. Morning broke gray and sullen. The rain had stopped, leaving a heavy, clinging mist that settled in the valleys. Jack dressed methodically. Jeans, heavy boots, a flannel shirt. Over it, a loose, weather-beaten Carhartt jacket. Before leaving the bedroom, he opened the lockbox under his bed. The cold, heavy steel of his Sig Sauer P226 felt alien in his hand, yet profoundly familiar. He checked the magazine, slapped it home, and slid it into the concealed holster at his hip. The jacket covered the print entirely. Titan was waiting by the door. "You're staying," Jack said, pointing a finger at the blanket. The dog sat. He didn't move, but his eyes followed Jack with an intensity that made the hair on Jack's arm stand up. "I mean it." Jack locked the door behind him and climbed into the truck. Downtown Oak Haven was a single strip of asphalt lined with faded brick buildings. Half the storefronts were boarded up. The remaining businesses, a hardware store, a dive bar, a diner, and a feed shop, clung to life with grim determination. Jack parked diagonally in front of Miller's Feed and Seed. He stepped out, his knee clicking loudly, and walked inside. The bell above the door jingled cheerfully, entirely at odds with the thick, dusty air of the shop. Tom, the owner, a man whose spine was permanently curved from lifting 80-pound bags of grain, looked up from the register. "Morning, Jack," Tom said, his voice lacking any real energy. "Need more firewood, Tarp?" "Puppy food," Jack said, keeping his voice level. "High protein, and some formula replacer if you have it." Tom's eyebrows went up. He wiped his hands on his dirty apron. "Didn't know you were a dog man. Got a new pup?" "Oh, found him," Jack lied smoothly. "Wandering up by the ridge. Skin and bones." Tom nodded, turning down an aisle to grab a bag. "Lots of strays lately. People can't afford to feed themselves, let alone animals." He hauled a heavy bag of Purina to the counter. "Shame, though. Here some folks are making good money catching strays and selling them down south." Jack didn't react. He pulled his wallet out. "Down south?" "Just rumors," Tom mumbled, suddenly looking nervous. He wouldn't meet Jack's eyes. "You know how people talk." The bell above the door jingled again. The air in the room instantly grew heavy. Jack didn't turn around, but he watched the reflection in the dirty glass of the display case. Sheriff Davies walked in. He was a big man, running to fat around the middle, but he carried it with the aggressive swagger of a high school bully who had never grown up. His uniform was crisp, the brass star on his chest polished to a mirror shine. "Tom!" Davies barked, the sound echoing off the metal shelving. "Sheriff!" Tom replied, his voice an octave higher than it had been a moment ago. "What can I do for you?" Davies ignored him. He stepped up beside Jack. crowding his space just a fraction of an inch too much. It was an intimidation tactic. Jack recognized it instantly. He didn't move. "Cole," Davy said, looking Jack up and down. "Didn't expect to see you in town. Usually you stay up on that mountain playing hermit." "Ran out of coffee," Jack said, paying Tom for the dog food. Davies looked at the heavy bag of high-protein puppy kibble. A slow, ugly smile spread across his face. "Puppy food?" Davies asked, his voice suddenly very quiet. "That's interesting, because we had a break-in out at the county kennels 2 nights ago. Some vandal stole a purebred German Shepherd pup. Expensive animal. State property." Jack picked up the bag with his left hand, leaving his right free near his hip. He turned his head slowly, meeting the sheriff's eyes. The man's pupils were pinned. He smelled like stale coffee and cheap peppermint. "Is that right?" Jack said, his tone devoid of any emotion. "Yeah," Davy said, leaning in. "If a man were to find a dog like that, he'd be smart to turn it in. Lots of bad elements out there. People get hurt sticking their noses where they don't belong." Jack held the sheriff's gaze. The silence stretched, tight and dangerous, like a wire pulled to the snapping point. "I'll keep an eye out, Sheriff," Jack said softly. He walked out of the store, the bell jingling behind him. As he tossed the bag of food into the bed of his truck, Jack looked down the street. At the far end of town, silhouetted against the gray sky, stood the rusted smokestacks of the old Miller rendering plant. They weren't just going to come for the dog. They were going to come for him. And for the first time in years, Jack felt the familiar cold fire of a mission settling into his blood. Jack didn't drive straight to the plant. That was how amateurs died. He took the logging trails back up the mountain, the Ford suspension groaning over washouts and exposed roots until he reached the cabin. The rain had started again, a steady freezing drizzle that coated the pine needles in a layer of ice. He unlocked the front door. Titan was exactly where he had left him, sitting on the wool blanket. The pup didn't wag his tail. He just watched Jack with those ancient amber eyes. Jack walked past the dog and went straight to the heavy steel gun safe bolted to the floorboards in his bedroom closet. He spun the dial. The mechanism clicked open with a heavy, oiled thud. Jack hadn't touched the tactical gear inside for 3 years. He pulled out a worn canvas duffel bag and dumped it on the bed. He bypassed the assault rifles. Too loud, too much penetration for a concrete building filled with civilians and dogs. He grabbed a Remington 870 pump-action shotgun. The barrel was sawed down to 18 inches, the woodstock scarred from sand and rock in places far hotter than Oregon. He loaded the tubular magazine with beanbag rounds first, followed by heavy double-O buckshot. If he had to drop someone permanently, he would. But he wanted options. He stripped off the flannel shirt and pulled on a black long-sleeve thermal, strapping a Kevlar vest over his ribs. He checked the Sig Sauer P226, sliding an extra magazine into his belt. Finally, he grabbed 3 heavy zip ties and a high-lumen tactical flashlight. He walked back out to the main room. He knelt in front of the wood stove, tossing in 2 thick logs, and looked at Titan. "I'm going to get your family," Jack said. His voice was a low rasp. "You hold down the fort." He poured a mountain of kibble into a bowl, filled a pot with water, and walked out the door. The drive to the Miller rendering plant took an hour. Jack didn't take the main highway. He killed his headlights 2 miles out, driving by the pale, ambient glow of the moon filtering through the cloud cover. He parked the truck in a dense thicket of blackberry brambles off an abandoned logging spur, locked the doors, and racked a shell into the chamber of the Remington. The walk to the plant was brutal. His bad knee screamed with every step, the damp cold seeping through his denim jeans, settling deep into the joint. But his mind was quiet. The static that usually buzzed in his head, the nightmares, the guilt, the endless loop of the ambush that had killed his team, was gone. The mission had replaced it. Focus narrowed his world to the mud beneath his boots, the wind in the pines, and the rusted chain-link fence looming ahead. The Miller plant was an industrial graveyard. 4 massive corrugated steel buildings sat decaying against the edge of a flooded quarry. The air here was foul, thick with the smell of wet rust, chemical runoff, and something deeper and more primal. Fear. Jack crouched behind a rusted-out bulldozer 50 yards from the main loading bay. 3 pickup trucks were parked near the heavy steel doors. Yellow light spilled onto the cracked asphalt from a gap in the bay entrance. 2 men stood under the awning, smoking. They were dressed in cheap Carhartt knockoffs, passing a flask back and forth. One held a rusted pipe. The other had a pistol tucked loosely into the waistband of his jeans. Amateurs. Jack moved. He didn't run. He glided. 10 years of moving through hostile territory had taught him how to roll his feet, heel to toe, absorbing the sound of his own weight. He flanked them, using the shadows cast by a towering pile of discarded tires. The rain masked whatever slight noise he made. He waited until the man with the pistol turned to spit into the mud. Jack stepped out of the dark. He swung the heavy wooden stock of the Remington upward in a tight, vicious arc. It caught the pistol-carrying guard under the jaw. The man's eyes rolled back, his jaw shattering with a wet crunch, and he folded into the mud without a sound. The second man spun around, dropping his cigarette, his mouth opening to yell. Jack didn't give him the chance. He lunged forward, driving the barrel of the shotgun directly into the man's solar plexus. The guard doubled over, gasping, the air violently expelled from his lungs. Jack brought his elbow down hard, on the base of the man's neck. He collapsed, unconscious, before his face hit the concrete. Jack worked fast. He dragged both men behind a rusted dumpster, binding their wrists and ankles with the heavy zip ties. He stripped the pistol from the first man's belt, cleared the chamber, and tossed it into the flooded quarry behind the plant. He approached the metal door. The gap was just wide enough to slip through. He pressed his back against the freezing, damp steel and listened. Over the rhythmic hum of an industrial generator, he heard it. The low, frantic barking of dogs. And beneath that, the muffled, ugly sound of men cheering. The sound of money-changing hands over spilled blood. Jack closed his eyes. He took one slow, deep breath, letting the icy air fill his lungs. He let it out slowly. He wasn't the broken hermit of Oak Haven anymore. He was a weapon, uncased and loaded. He slipped through the gap into the suffocating heat of the rendering plant. The interior of the plant was a cavern of rusted catwalks and massive, empty holding tanks. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the coppery stench of blood. Jack moved along the perimeter wall, staying in the deep shadows cast by the overhead piping. The main event was happening in the center of the warehouse. A massive concrete settling pit, maybe 20 feet across and 5 feet deep, had been drained and lined with plywood. Around it stood roughly 40 men. They were mill workers, loggers, mechanics, the desperate, angry remnants of a town that had been left to rot. They were waving cash, screaming down into the pit. At the edge of the pit, standing on a wooden pallet to elevate himself above the mud, was Sheriff Davies. He was holding a thick ledger, an unlit cigar clamped in his teeth, his uniform jacket unbuttoned. Beside him stood Mayor Higgins, a slight nervous man in an expensive raincoat, looking terribly out of place, but gripping a wad of $100 bills with white knuckles. Against the far wall, away from the screaming crowd, were the cages. Jack's eyes locked onto them. They were small, rusted wire crates stacked 3 high. Inside were a dozen dogs. Most were scarred pit bulls and mastiff mixes, cowering or pacing frantically. But in the bottom corner crate, pressed together in a terrified, shivering pile, were 4 German Shepherd puppies. Titan's litter. Jack's jaw locked. He looked up at the ceiling. The warehouse was lit by 4 massive halogen work lights strung up on heavy-duty extension cords, all tracing back to a single breaker box on the near wall. Jack slid the Remington sling over his shoulder. He drew the Sig Sauer. He moved to the breaker box. He didn't just flip the switches. He raised the heavy steel butt of the shotgun and smashed the entire panel inward. Sparks showered the concrete floor in a blinding fountain of blue and white light. And then, absolute darkness. The cheering stopped instantly. A collective gasp echoed through the cavernous space. "Hey, who hit the generator?" Davy's voice boomed over the crowd, laced with sudden panic. "Get some flashlights on." Jack didn't wait for their eyes to adjust. He pulled the high-lumen tactical flashlight from his belt, held it out to the side in his left hand, and clicked it on. But he didn't use a steady beam. He hit the strobe function. A blinding, rapid-fire pulse of white light ripped through the darkness, strobing at 20 flashes per second. It hit the crowd like a physical blow. Men screamed, throwing their hands over their eyes, completely disoriented by the violent, stuttering illumination. The shadows danced erratically, making the room look like a fragmented nightmare. Jack stepped forward, raised the shotgun with his right hand, and fired a beanbag round into the corrugated tin ceiling. The boom inside the enclosed space was deafening. It sounded like an artillery shell. Panic erupted. The crowd shattered, men shoving and trampling each other as they sprinted blindly for the exits, tearing through the darkness to escape the blinding strobe and the gunfire. They didn't care about the dogs. They didn't care about their bets. They just wanted to live. Jack ignored the fleeing cowards. He kept the strobe pinned directly on the raised pallet. Mayor Higgins was already running, scrambling over a rusted pipe and disappearing into the fleeing mob. But Davies didn't run. The sheriff drew his service weapon, squinting against the blinding light, trying to find a target. "I'll kill you!" Davies roared, firing a blind shot that ricocheted off a steel beam 20 feet to Jack's left. Jack dropped the flashlight. As it rolled across the floor, painting the walls in erratic slices of light, Jack sprinted forward. Davies fired again, the muzzle flash illuminating his panicked face. Jack slid on the slick concrete, dropping below the line of fire. He drove his heavy boot directly into Davies' kneecap. The bone gave way with a sickening crack. Davies shrieked, collapsing forward. Jack was up in a fraction of a second. He grabbed Davies' gun hand, twisting the wrist violently inward until the sheriff dropped the weapon, then drove his elbow into the man's jaw. Davies hit the plywood platform, out cold before the blood even began to pool under his face. The warehouse was suddenly quiet, save for the generator's hum and the distant sound of tires squealing on asphalt as the crowd fled. Jack picked up the flashlight and turned it off. He grabbed the thick leather ledger Davies had dropped. He shoved it inside his coat. That book contained every bribe, every bet, and every name involved in this operation. The FBI field office in Portland would have a field day with it. He walked over to the cages. The adult dogs were barking wildly now, but the 4 shepherd pups were dead silent. They watched Jack with the exact same unnerving intensity as their brother. Jack found a heavy set of bolt cutters resting against the wall. He snapped the padlocks off the puppy crate. He didn't try to coax them. He just reached in, grabbed 2 under each arm, and zipped his heavy coat around them to keep them secure. They smelled of terror and filth, but they were alive. He walked out of the plant, leaving Davies bleeding in the dark. By the time Jack's truck rumbled back up the mountain trail, the storm had finally broken. Pale morning light filtered through the towering pines, casting long, peaceful shadows across the muddy road. Jack parked the truck and carried the 4 pups inside the cabin. He set them down on the floor. Titan stood up from his blanket. He walked over to his siblings. There was no chaotic puppy playing, no barking. They just huddled together in a tight, shivering mass of fur. Titan stood at the front of the pack, looking up at Jack. Jack stripped off his tactical vest, his body aching, his knees screaming in agony. He looked at the 5 dogs sitting on his floor. Then he looked at the ledger sitting on his counter. He had a drive to Portland to make tomorrow. The mayor and the sheriff were going away for a long, long time. Jack walked over to the wood stove, added another log, and sat down heavily on the floor next to the dogs. He didn't want a dog. But as 5 sets of amber eyes watched him, Jack realized the war was finally over. He had a family to raise. Wow, what an intense ride. Jack went in there and absolutely dismantled that corrupt operation to save those pups. Hit that like button if you love seeing Sheriff Davies get what he deserved. Share this incredible story of redemption with your friends, and make sure to subscribe to our channel for more gripping emotional stories just like this. See you in the next video.